Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The year is 1091, and the greatest city in Christendom is holding its breath. Constantinople, the new Rome, a metropolis of nearly 500,000 souls, shimmers behind its triple Theodosian walls so immense that they have turned back every army for 7 centuries. From the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, the city cascades with marble forums, gilded domes, and monumental bronze statues. Yet if you climb to the top of the fortifications near the gate of Carisius on a crisp spring morning, you would see something that makes even the most hardened imperial guardsmen's blood run cold. Just across the narrow Bosphorus, on the Asian shore of Chalcedon, thousands of dark tents flap in the wind, their horsemen patrolling the coast within bowshot of the water. These are the Seljuk Turks, heirs of the steppe, who in the last 20 years have swallowed the empire's richest provinces, the high plateaus of Anatolia, the valleys of Bithynia, and the ancient cities of Nicaea and Nicomedia. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the purple in a coup in 1081, is no ordinary ruler. He is a man of medium stature, broad-shouldered, with intense dark eyes and a soldier's scarred hands, a general who has fought the Normans in the west, the Pecheneg in the north, and now faces the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, whose name, Rome, deliberately mocks the imperial legacy. Alexios knows that the empire's traditional armies of thematic levies and mercenary Varangians are simply not enough anymore. The old recruitment system collapsed along with the Anatolian farmlands, and the heavy cavalry tagmata have been decimated in a dozen bloody rearguard actions. He needs shock troops, men clad head to toe in chain mail and trained from boyhood in the Frankish manner of couched lance charges, the very tactic that nearly undid him at Dyrrhachium a decade earlier. And so, in the great palace's ink-scented chancery, Alexios composes the most fateful letter of the Middle Ages, a missive addressed to the Bishop of Rome, Pope Urban II. This chapter plunges directly into the sweltering imperial scriptorium, where the emperor dictates a document that will echo through time, a desperate plea for military aid wrapped in the ornate rhetoric of Christian brotherhood, completely unaware that he is about to light a fuse that will explode the known world. The letter itself, though no original copy survives, can be reconstructed from multiple chroniclers, most notably the detailed accounts left by Alexios' own daughter, the Princess Anna Komnene, whose Alexiad is our finest window into the Byzantine mind. Alexios' words were a masterpiece of diplomatic subtlety and emotive power, carefully calibrated for a Latin audience he understood only partially. He began not with a blunt request for mercenaries, but with a lamentation over the suffering of the Eastern churches and the pilgrims who could no longer safely visit the holy places. The emperor described, in vivid and sometimes embellished detail, how Seljuk emirs were desecrating altars, turning basilicas into stables, circumcising Christian boys by force, and pouring the blood of monks into the very chalices once used for the Eucharist. These stories were not entirely fabrications. There had indeed been atrocities, but Alexios selectively amplified them, omitting the numerous pragmatic agreements he had already made with various Turkish beyliks to keep trade flowing and borders quasi-stable. His intention was to appeal to the Pope's pastoral heart and to the feudal lord's chivalric pride, hoping that the horror of sacred places defiled would galvanize the Latin world into sending a manageable expeditionary force. He carefully avoided any suggestion of a massive popular movement, envisioning perhaps 500 to 1,000 Frankish knights, men like those he had hired in small numbers before, who could be paid with gold and settled on frontier fiefs to protect the newly recovered lands. In his mind, this was a purely tactical arrangement, a restoration of the eastern frontier that would allow the Roman Empire to slowly digest its lost territories, one fortified city at a time, under the firm control of the imperial bureaucracy and the Orthodox Church. The geopolitical chessboard upon which Alexios placed his letter was diabolically complex, and his miscalculation lay partly in underestimating the enormous religious and political transformation sweeping through Latin Christendom. For over a century, the Papacy had been clawing its way out of the chaos of the pornocracy, the era of debauched noble popes, and had launched the Gregorian reform, a radical movement that sought not only to purify the clergy from simony and concubinage but to subordinate all temporal rulers, emperors, kings, and counts, to the spiritual authority of St. Peter's successor. The investiture controversy, which pitted Pope Gregory VII against the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, had just culminated in the humiliation of Canossa in 1077 and the subsequent sacking of Rome by imperial troops in 1084. The exiled Gregory had died in Salerno, and his successor Victor III had been a frail transitional figure, but by 1091 a new pope was consolidating his power, Urban II, born Odo of Chatillon, a French nobleman of impeccable Cluniac background, an astute diplomat who wanted to heal the bitter schism between the Eastern and Western churches, but entirely on his own terms. With the Patriarch of Constantinople acknowledging Roman primacy. When Alexios' embassy, led by Byzantine envoys carrying silk-wrapped scrolls sealed with the imperial golden bulla, finally reached Urban's itinerant court, the Pope saw not a plea for help but a providential opportunity to achieve multiple goals at once, to demonstrate papal supremacy by summoning the knights of Europe to a cause sanctified by Rome, to channel the endemic violence of feudal society outward against the infidel, and to position himself as the undisputed leader of a reunited Christendom. The Byzantine diplomatic mission arrived at a moment of acute crisis for Urban II, who was still struggling to establish himself in Rome against the antipope Clement III, a creature of the German emperor. Urban was moving between the loyal cities of Italy and southern France, holding councils and building alliances. He could not even safely reside in the Lateran Palace for long stretches. In March 1095, he convened the Council of Piacenza, a massive assembly of bishops, abbots, and lay lords that also heard an urgent appeal from Alexios' ambassadors. The chronicler Bernold of Constance records that the envoys, dressed in the somber robes of Byzantine courtiers, addressed the council with passionate eloquence, imploring the knights of the West to come to the aid of the beleaguered empire that was hemmed in on all sides by pagans and barbarians. They spoke of the strategic city of Nicaea, just 80 miles from Constantinople, now the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan I, whose very courtiers rode under the walls of the Queen of Cities on hunting expeditions. The Pope listened carefully, and while he gave no immediate response, the seed was planted. Urban knew that a grand military expedition under papal blessing would eclipse the German emperor's influence in Italy, restore papal prestige after decades of humiliation, and provide a glorious outlet for the restless, heavily armed Frankish nobility that was tearing itself apart in petty private wars. The emperor's carefully calibrated request for 500 knights was about to be transmuted into something far more grandiose and terrifying. The cultural chasm between the Byzantine East and the Latin West, which Alexios grievously miscalculated, was already deeper than most modern observers realize. For centuries, the two halves of the old Roman Empire had drifted apart linguistically, theologically, and militarily. The Byzantines called themselves Romans, and viewed the Westerners as uncouth barbarians, Franks, whose kingdoms were ephemeral upstart regimes carved from the corpse of the true empire. The Latins, in turn, saw the Greeks as effeminate, duplicitous schismatics who wallowed in luxury while the holy places of Christ's Passion groaned under infidel rule. The Great Schism of 1054, though not yet seen as a final rupture by contemporaries, had left a toxic legacy of mutual excommunications over the filioque clause, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and papal claims to universal jurisdiction. When Alexios' letter emphasized the desecration of churches and the persecution of Christians, without specifying denomination, he inadvertently played into the Pope's narrative that the Latin Church, as the one true Church, had a the very language of holy war, foreign to Byzantine tradition with its deep-seated ambivalence about killing, was about to be invented by the Latin churchmen. Back in Constantinople, throughout the early 1090s, Alexios continued to deal with the Turkish threat through his preferred method, diplomacy, bribery, and divide-and-conquer tactics that had served him well against the Pecheneg, whom he had annihilated at the Battle of Livonian in April 1091 with the help of Cuman allies. That battle, in which tens of thousands of Pecheneg warriors were slaughtered on the banks of the Maritsa River, had been a textbook Byzantine combined arms operation, luring the enemy into a trap and closing the jaws of the heavy cavalry and infantry under the personal command of Alexios and the Cuman chieftains. The victory gave the empire a breathing space in the Balkans, but it also reinforced Alexios's conviction that the Western heavy cavalry was a tool to be used, not an ally to be trusted. He had fought against the Normans of Robert Guiscard and his son Bohemond for years, and he knew firsthand the avarice and ambition of the Latin lords. His request for mercenaries was thus framed with elaborate contractual safeguards. He would pay the knights in gold, provide them with supplies and guides, and require them to swear oaths of fealty that would make them his vassals, returning any former Byzantine cities they captured directly to the imperial domain. The Alexiad shows that the emperor had already developed a sophisticated protocol for absorbing foreign soldiers into the Byzantine army, granting them pronoi, land grants in exchange for military service, and expecting them to convert to orthodoxy and assimilate. Nothing in his letter to Urban suggested a mass migration of armed peasants and lords acting under independent command, answering only to the Pope and their own princes. That catastrophic misreading of what the papacy could and would unleash remains one of history's most poignant ironies. The envoys that Alexios dispatched to Urban II were not mere couriers but high-ranking courtiers, possibly including members of the imperial family or senior clergy, men who could speak Latin and argue the empire's case with the subtle sophistication of Byzantine diplomacy. The journey from Constantinople to Rome or wherever the papal court might be found usually took several months, crossing the Aegean to Dyrrhachium, then traveling the old Via Egnatia to the Adriatic coast, embarking for Bari or Brindisi, and then proceeding north through the tumultuous Italian peninsula where imperial and anti-imperial factions warred in every city. The ambassadors carried not only the written letter but also verbal instructions allowing them to modulate the tone. In public, they were to stress the suffering of the holy places and the shared Christian duty. In private, with the Pope, they were authorized to hint at the possibility of theological reconciliation and even discuss the emperor's willingness to receive Latin priests in Constantinople if the military aid arrived promptly and effectively. Alexios was playing a high-stakes game of diplomatic seduction, dangling the prospect of ecclesiastical union, the holy grail of papal policy, without ever making a concrete promise. He counted on the fact that the Pope would understand that any military assistance would be a prelude to deeper negotiations, not a crusade. But Urban II, a Frenchman who had been a canon at Reims and a prior at Cluny, thought in entirely different categories. He saw the East not as a political chessboard but as a sacred landscape marked by the footsteps of Christ, a patrimony that the successor of Peter had the duty to liberate and govern. To him, Alexios's plea was an invitation to redeem the Holy Land itself, a goal the Byzantine emperor had never so much as whispered to his clerks. The situation in Anatolia itself was indeed dire, though perhaps not quite as apocalyptic as Alexios's letter implied. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, under the young and brilliant Kilij Arslan I, controlled most of the central plateau from its capital at Nicaea, an insultingly close distance to Constantinople, whose spires could be seen from the hills on a clear day. The Turks were master horse archers who had adopted the ancient steppe tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement, devastating the slower Byzantine heavy infantry. However, the Seljuk realm was far from a monolithic empire. It was riven by internal rivalries between Kilij Arslan and his cousin, the Danish Mendemir, who held sway over the eastern regions around Sebastia and Caesarea. Alexios had skillfully exploited these divisions, paying subsidies to one chieftain to attack another, and even hiring Turkish mercenary squadrons to patrol the borders. His ultimate goal was to recover the western third of Anatolia, the coastal plains of Bithynia, the Sangarius River Valley, and the rich agricultural hinterlands that had once fed Constantinople. He was confident that with 500 Frankish knights to act as a mailed fist, he could roll back the Turkish beyliks, rebuild the native Orthodox population, and re-establish the old theme system that had been the backbone of imperial defense for half a millennium. His letter to the Pope was thus a focused, almost surgical instrument, intended to procure the precise military asset he lacked: heavily armored shock cavalry that could break the lighter Turkish horse archers in a set-piece battle, provided the engagement was fought under favorable conditions with imperial infantry and engineers in support. To understand just how far Urban II would take this simple request, we must examine the ideological revolution brewing in the Latin Church, the gradual sanctification of violence that would culminate in the doctrine of holy war. For centuries, the Church Fathers had wrestled with the morality of warfare, generally holding that killing, even in a just cause, was a sin requiring penance. The peace and truce of God movements in the 10th and 11th centuries had sought to limit feudal warfare to certain days and protect non-combatants, but the knightly class remained a barely tamed lion. Reformist popes, including Gregory VII, began to reframe military service as a positive act of piety if directed against the enemies of the Church. Gregory had already dreamed of leading an army to the east to help the Byzantines and recover the Holy Sepulchre, but the investiture controversy had consumed his papacy. Urban II inherited this nascent ideology and pushed it to its logical conclusion: a war authorized by the Pope for the liberation of Jerusalem and the defense of Eastern Christians would not only be just but would carry spiritual merit so extraordinary that all past sins could be remitted. The concept of the indulgence, the remission of temporal punishment for sin, was still evolving, but at Clermont it would be applied wholesale to the crusading vow. Alexios had asked for mercenaries whose souls would be cleansed by their service to the Christian emperor. Urban promised warriors that their service would cancel all penance and open the gates of paradise, a theological incentive the emperor could never have imagined. The diplomatic timeline tightened dramatically in early 1095 when Urban II traveled to his native France, the heartland of the feudal knightly culture that would provide the muscle for his great project. After the Council of Piacenza, he spent the summer crossing the Alps, entering the kingdom of Philip I, who was excommunicated for adultery, and skillfully avoiding the king while rallying the bishops and magnates loyal to the true pope. By August 1095, Urban was in Valence, then Le Puy, where he met Bishop Adhemer of Montail, the noble prelate who would be named papal legate for the coming expedition. Adhemer was a robust and pious warrior bishop, experienced in the rough politics of southern France, and his selection signaled that the expedition would be no purely spiritual pilgrimage, but a military campaign with explicit papal leadership. The Pope also wrote to the Knights of Flanders, a region long familiar to Alexios through the service of Flemish mercenaries, and specifically to Count Robert II of Flanders, whose father, Robert the Frisian, had sent 500 knights to Byzantium a few years earlier and had returned with tales of immense wealth and a personal oath of friendship with the emperor. Alexios's careful cultivation of the Flemish connection, which included lavish gifts and a relic of the True Cross, was about to backfire spectacularly, because the Count of Flanders was not merely flattered but genuinely inflamed with zeal, ready to contribute far more than a mere mercenary company to any holy enterprise the Pope would proclaim. The Council of Clermont convened on November 18, 1095, in the Auvergne region, a gathering of 13 archbishops, more than 200 bishops, and a vast multitude of abbots, priests, and lay lords who filled the cathedral and spilled out into the open fields because no building could contain the crowd. Urban II presided in majesty. The exact words of the speech are lost, but the multiple contemporary accounts by Fulcher of Chartres, Robert the Monk, and Baldric of Bourgueil, though written later, converge on key themes. Urban began by describing the dire situation of the Eastern Christians and the desecration of the holy places in terms far more graphic than Alexios's own letter, adding details about the Turks whipping the faithful to the ground and piercing their bellies with swords to see if there was gold hidden in their entrails. He explicitly expanded the geography of the crisis to include Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre itself, a city that had been in Muslim hands since 638, and about which Alexios had said nothing at all. This rhetorical expansion was the pivot that transformed a Byzantine frontier war into a cosmic struggle for the center of the earth. Urban then issued the call that would echo for centuries. Deus vult! God wills it! As the crowd erupted in a frenzy of weeping and shouts, tearing their cloaks into crosses and sewing them onto their shoulders. The Pope's promise of indulgences was the explosive element that Alexios's strategic letter had inadvertently triggered. Urban decreed that anyone who took the vow to march to Jerusalem out of pure devotion, not for honor or money, would receive a full remission of all sins, plenary indulgence. To a feudal society saturated with the fear of hell, where even a baron who had committed countless acts of violence and lust could spend decades endowing monasteries to pray for his soul, the offer of immediate and total spiritual cleansing was intoxicating beyond measure. The Pope also attached temporal incentives. The lands and families of crusaders would be protected by the Church's peace, their debts suspended or cancelled, their legal disputes stayed. This was an entire social contract wrapped in a religious cause, and it worked spectacularly. Knights who had been fighting each other for cattle and castles suddenly found a way to redeem their violent profession without forsaking it, channeling their aggression outward against an enemy defined as the enemy of God. Alexios had offered gold and land, Urban offered heaven itself, and the emperor simply could not compete on that spiritual plane. The news raced through France like a prairie fire, carried by papal preachers who used every barn and village crossroad to recruit, while the official proclamation was disseminated by letters to the archbishops of Tours, Rouen, Reims, and Sens, setting in motion the largest organized armed pilgrimage the world had ever seen. In Constantinople, the first rumors of what had been unleashed arrived months later, filtered through Italian merchants, returning pilgrims, and eventually official papal correspondence that carefully omitted the more inflammatory anti-Greek rhetoric. Alexios, by now master of the empire for 15 years, realized with growing horror that he had called up forces he could not command. He had expected something like the efficient Flemish contingent his father-in-law had employed. He was getting a migration of nations. The first wave was not the disciplined columns of princes but the so-called People's Crusade, an unorganized mass of peasants, townsfolk, minor knights, and millenarian visionaries, led by the charismatic but entirely uncontrolled Peter the Hermit and the knight Walter Sands of Loire. They were already moving east, pillaging their way through Hungary and the Balkans, raiding Byzantine market towns, and in several notorious instances massacring Jewish communities in the Rhineland cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz in a sickening prelude of religious violence that horrified both Alexios's orthodox sensibilities and the Pope's more orderly agenda. When the ragged horde finally straggled into Constantinople in August 1096, the emperor faced a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of starving, fanatical, and ungovernable people camped outside his capital, demanding to be shipped across the Bosphorus immediately to fight the Turks. The careful, diplomatic mechanism he had set in motion was now a runaway juggernaut, and his frantic efforts to control it, feeding them, housing them, and urgently trying to impress upon Peter the Hermit the need to wait for the professional armies, proved futile. Within days of crossing the strait, the people's Alexios's personal response to the disaster at Civitate, as recorded by his daughter, was a mixture of grief, frustration, and strategic recalibration. He had tried to warn them, sending envoys to Peter begging him to delay, but the hermit had lost control of his own followers, who accused the Byzantines of treachery. Now the emperor had to prepare for the arrival of the far more formidable princely armies, the hosts of Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a brooding and pious giant, his brother Baldwin of Boulogne, sharp-eyed and ambitious, the veteran warrior Raymond IV of Toulouse, already in his 50s, who would bring the largest Provençal contingent, the brilliantly ferocious Norman Prince Bohemond of Taranto. Alexios's old enemy from the wars against Robert Guiscard, Bohemond's nephew Tancred, a young paragon of chivalric fervor, and the Norman Duke Robert Curthose of Normandy, along with Stephen of Blois and Robert of Flanders. The total force would number perhaps 40,000 armored knights and foot soldiers, with a civilian tail of non-combatants, an army larger than anything Alexios could field and entirely beyond his logistical control. The emperor's original plea for 500 mercenaries had been amplified, distorted, and inflated into the greatest military enterprise since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the man who had once thought to manipulate the West now had to figure out how to survive it. The first chapter of our story ends here, with Alexios looking out from his sea walls at the approaching columns of dust raised by the Crusader hosts, realizing that the letter he dictated in the chancery had rewritten the map of the world, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The chancery of the great palace of Constantinople where Alexios I Komnenos dictated his historic letter was a crucible of ancient bureaucratic tradition, a labyrinth of ink-splashed desks where copyists fluent in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Armenian worked by the dim light of oil lamps to produce the empire's diplomatic correspondence. The emperor, himself a man of literary refinement who had been tutored by the finest rhetoricians of the capital, understood the immense weight that a single imperial missive could carry. For centuries, Byzantine foreign policy had been waged with parchment and gold as much as with swords and fire ships. As he composed the plea to Urban II, Alexios drew upon a deep institutional memory of diplomatic protocol. His own father-in-law, the Caesar John Doukas, had negotiated with Latin lords before, and the emperor's secretaries, such as the protonotarios of the dramas, ensured that the letters' salutations, titles, and theological phrasing were precisely calibrated to flatter the Roman pontiff without conceding a single inch of orthodox doctrinal primacy. The imperial bulla, a heavy gold seal depicting Christ Pantocrator on one side and the emperor in full imperial regalia on the other, was affixed to the purple silk ribbon that would identify the document as an authentic communication from the Basilius Autocrator, the vicegerent of God on earth, to the Bishop of Old Rome. Everything about the physical letter screamed legitimacy, hierarchy, and the august weight of a civilization that traced its institutions back to Constantine and Augustus. But it was the content, the carefully phrased tales of desecrated churches and slaughtered pilgrims, that would unwittingly provide the papacy with the raw emotional material to forge a new doctrine of holy war. To fully grasp the magnitude of Alexios's miscalculation, we must delve into the intricate web of his own military experiences and the specific tactical deficiencies that prompted his request. The Byzantine army of the late 11th century was a shadow of the fearsome legions that had once reconquered Africa and Italy under Justinian or smashed the Arab caliphates under the Macedonian dynasty. The disaster at Manzikert in August 1071, when the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan crushed the army of Romanos IV Diogenes largely due to the treachery of the Doukas family, had not only cost the empire its Anatolian heartland but also shattered the morale and institutional coherence of the native military aristocracy. The thematic armies, regional peasant soldiers who defended their own farms, had disintegrated as the Turkish raids depopulated the plateau. The elite tagmata regiments of the Scolai, Excubitors, and Hikonatoi had been reduced to parade ground formations guarding the capital. Alexios himself, during his early campaigns, had been forced to cobble together ad hoc forces of foreign mercenaries, English Varangians exiled after the Norman conquest, Norman knights of fortune, Pecheneg horse archers, and even Turkish auxiliaries, and had learned the hard lesson that paid soldiers were only as loyal as their last purse. His demand for Western heavy cavalry was thus born of painful personal observation. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, the Norman knights of Robert Guiscard had shattered the imperial line with their devastating couched lance charges, riding knee-to-knee in tight formations that overwhelmed the less heavily armored Byzantine cataphractoi. Alexios had seen the future of warfare and it wore Frankish mail, and he was determined to appropriate that power for his own purposes. To use the Latin wedge formation against the fluid but fragile Turkish horse archers who lacked the mass to stop a full-scale cavalry charge. His letter to the Pope was an attempt to rent that power wholesale, a commercial transaction dressed in the language of Christian solidarity. The precise wording that the envoys conveyed verbally, and possibly in supplementary documents now lost, included specific strategic targets that made perfect sense in the context of Byzantine Reconquista. The primary objective was the recovery of Nicaea, the ancient city on the eastern shore of Lake Ascanius, a mere day's march from the Propontis coast. Nicaea had been captured by the Seljuks in 1081 and had become the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, its formidable double walls and 300 towers bristling with Turkish garrison troops. Alexios knew that if Nicaea could be retaken, the entire western third of Anatolia would lose its political center, and the empire could push its frontier back to the high Anatolian plateau, using the natural barrier of the Pontic Mountains to create a defensible border. In addition, the emperor wanted to secure the fertile valleys of the Sangarius and Rhindacus rivers, the old Opsician and Thracian themes, whose broad wheat fields and horse-rearing plains had once fed Constantinople and filled the imperial stables with fine cavalry mounts. His request to the Pope, filtered through the diplomatic conventions, was essentially a proposal for a joint Byzantine-Latin military campaign under overall imperial command, with the Franks providing the shock cavalry and the Empire providing the infantry, engineers, naval transport, and logistical support. The classic Byzantine recipe for combined arms. At no point did Alexios mention Jerusalem, which lay hundreds of miles beyond the Roman frontier of Antioch, a city that had been lost to the empire only 14 years earlier in 1084, but which even the ambitious emperor saw as a distant, almost mythological prize. Jerusalem belonged to the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, a relatively tolerant Shiite power with whom the Byzantines maintained a working diplomatic and commercial relationship, including the right to repair Christian churches in the Holy City. The notion of conquering Jerusalem for Christendom was entirely alien to Alexios' strategic calculus, and he would have seen it as a strategic absurdity that would overextend his supply lines and provoke a unified Muslim response. His miscalculation was to assume that the Pope would think the same way. Pope Urban II's personal background and theological worldview rendered him uniquely receptive to transforming a limited military request into a cosmic religious war. Born Odo of Logri around 1035 to the noble Chatillon family of Champagne, he was educated at the Cathedral School of Reims under the future Pope Gregory VII, imbibing the radical Gregorian doctrines of papal monarchy and the purification of the Church. As a young canon, he witnessed the seismic clash between Henry IV and Gregory, the excommunications, the penitential humiliation of Canossa, and the brutal reality that the sword of temporal kings could still silence the voice of St. Peter. Later, as a monk and then prior of the great Burgundian Abbey of Cluny, Odo absorbed the Cluniac spirituality that emphasized the liturgy, intercession for the dead, and the sanctity of pilgrimage to the holy places, most especially to Jerusalem, which had become, in the Western imagination, the center of the world, a mystical city of gold and precious stones where Christ would return at the end of days. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was already a growing phenomenon among the laity, with large companies of penitent nobles and commoners braving the Alpine passes and the Mediterranean pirates to pray at the Rock of Calvary. Odo, now Pope Urban II, fused this pilgrimage piety with the military ethos of his Frankish homeland, envisioning an armed pilgrimage that would cleanse the holy places with blood and fire and, in the process, demonstrate that the Pope, not the German Emperor or the Byzantine Basilius, was the true leader of Christendom. Alexios' letter, with its pitiful descriptions of tortured pilgrims and profaned altars, was the spark that ignited a fire already laid in the tinder-dry undergrowth of Latin spirituality. The geopolitical map of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1090s was far more complicated than the simple binary of Christian versus Muslim that would later be used to justify the Crusade. The Seljuk Empire, though nominally united under the Great Sultan in Baghdad, was in fact fragmenting into a patchwork of warring principalities. Kilij Arslan I, the Sultan of Rum, was locked in a bitter struggle with the Danish Mende Emirate to the east over the cities of Melitene and Sebastia, while further south, the Syrian cities of Aleppo, Damascus, and Antioch were controlled by rival Turkish Atabegs who had little love for the Sultan of Rum and sometimes allied with the Byzantines against each other. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, with its capital at Cairo, a magnificent city of gardens and mosques, controlled the Palestinian coast and Jerusalem itself but was on the verge of its own internal collapse due to factionalism and the rise of powerful viziers. Alexios, a master of exploiting such divisions, had established secret channels of communication with the Fatimid court, offering to divide the Levant into spheres of influence, and maintain the status quo in Jerusalem in exchange for a joint front against the Seljuks. These negotiations were delicate and required absolute secrecy. If the Latin world learned that the Christian emperor was treating with the heretical Fatimids, the scandal would undermine the entire moral foundation of his plea for aid. Yet this was precisely the kind of subtle, multi-layered diplomacy that Alexios excelled at, and it explains why he was so utterly horrified when the crusade began to coalesce around the slogan of liberating Jerusalem, because his own diplomats were in Cairo at that very moment promising the Fatimids that the empire had no designs on the holy city. The crusade was not only an uncontrollable military force, it was a diplomatic hand grenade rolled into his carefully constructed web of alliances. The role of the Latin chroniclers in magnifying and distorting Alexios's original message cannot be overstated. When the envoys spoke at the Council of Piacenza, they delivered an oral report that, according to the limited surviving accounts, emphasized the strategic vulnerability of Constantinople and the need to defend it as the bulwark of Christendom. However, the Western listeners, who had never seen the gleaming domes of Hagia Sophia or understood the Byzantine worldview, translated everything into their own cultural idiom. To a Frankish knight, the defense of Constantinople meant a glorious battle against the pagan horde. To the Byzantine diplomat, it meant a carefully managed counter-offensive with limited objectives. The Italian monk and historian Bernold of St. Blasian notes that the ambassador's speech caused many to weep and to vow pilgrimage to the east, which is exactly the emotional response Alexios had hoped for, but with an uncontrollable popular dimension that he had not anticipated. By the time Urban II gave his great speech at Clermont, he had taken the raw material of the Byzantine plea and refashioned it into a narrative of cosmic redemption. The holy places were not merely threatened, they were in bondage, and the knights of France were the new Maccabees, the new Israelites, called to smite the Amalekites and reclaim the inheritance of Christ. The emperor's letter, a pragmatic request for 500 heavy cavalry, had become the Book of Deuteronomy, a call to holy war that promised a land flowing with milk and honey to those who followed the sword of the Lord. The figure of the knight in late 11th century Latin society was the key variable that Alexios failed to factor into his equation. The term, miles, originally meaning simply a soldier or vassal, had evolved into a distinct social class defined by its monopoly on horse-riding warfare, its distinctive armor of chain-mail hauberk and conical helmet, and its code of honor that was only just beginning to be Christianized by the Peace of God movement. These knights were the product of a hyper-militarized society where a lord's power was measured in the number of armed retainers he could field, and where the eldest son usually inherited the fief, leaving younger sons with little more than a horse, a sword, and a burning desire to carve out their own lordships by any means necessary. France, the heartland of the Crusade, was fragmented into hundreds of petty fiefs, each with its own castle and its own private wars that made travel dangerous and trade precarious. The Gregorian reform had condemned the knights' endemic violence as sinful, but it had also, paradoxically, sanctified violence when directed in the service of the Church. Alexios was used to dealing with professional mercenaries like the Varangians or the Latinikoi, men who fought for pay and could be controlled by the purse strings. He had no conceptual framework for an entire class of landless, heaven-seeking warriors who believed that dying in battle against the infidel was a fast track to paradise. When tens of thousands of these knights took the cross, they were not for hire. They were on a divine mission, answerable only to God and the Pope, and the Byzantine emperor's gold meant nothing compared to the remission of sins. The recruitment mechanisms that Urban II put in place after Clermont were a masterpiece of medieval mass communication, employing every tool available to spread the crusading message. The Pope himself spent the next 6 months tirelessly touring France, consecrating altars, preaching in the open fields, and writing letters to the bishops of the entire Latin Church, commanding them to promulgate the expedition in their diocese. The letter to the faithful of Flanders, dated December 1095, explicitly mentioned the Byzantine emperor's supplication, stating that a barbaric fury has devastated the churches of God in the regions of the Orient, and has usurped the holy city itself, which is Christ's, thus retroactively inserting Jerusalem into the petition that had originally concerned only Anatolia. Papal legates were dispatched across Italy, Germany, England, and even Scandinavia, though with varying success. The Normans of southern Italy, fresh from their conquest of Sicily from the Muslims, were particularly receptive, seeing the crusade as a continuation of their own aggressive expansion. Popular preachers, often unauthorized and uncontrolled by the hierarchy, took up the cause with apocalyptic fervor, interpreting current events through the lens of the Book of Revelation and proclaiming that the end times were near and that the journey to Jerusalem was the last act of history before the second coming. The sermon at Clermont had unleashed a chain reaction of mass enthusiasm that papal authority could channel but not fully control, and the information filtering back to Constantinople was at best fragmented and at worst wildly inflated. leaving Alexios in a fog of uncertainty about what exactly was heading his way. The logistical challenge of moving an entire army from northern France to the gates of Constantinople was staggering, and the methods the Crusaders used to overcome it demonstrated a sophisticated blend of pilgrimage infrastructure, feudal obligation, and commercial networks that Alexios had not anticipated. The overland route, which most of the princely armies followed, passed through the Rhine Valley, across Bavaria and Hungary, and down through the Balkan provinces of the Byzantine Empire, a journey of well over 2,000 miles that could take 6 to 9 months of continuous marching. Each great lord had to finance his contingent through a combination of liquidating lands, pawning relics to monasteries, borrowing from Jewish moneylenders, and levying special taxes on their subjects, a massive mobilization of capital that restructured the economy of entire regions. The march itself required an immense trail of ox-drawn carts carrying weapons, armor, siege equipment, and provisions, as well as a mobile city of armorers, cooks, priests, and camp followers. The Crusaders expected to resupply at friendly Christian markets along the way, but their sheer numbers often overwhelmed local resources, leading to friction with the Balkan Slavic population and the Byzantine provincial governors. Alexios's military governorship system under the Dukes of Thessalonica, Dyrrhachium, and Adrianople was suddenly tasked with feeding and policing a moving population the size of a medium city, and the logistical strain nearly broke the imperial budget even before a single battle had been fought. The emperor was learning that you could not uninvite a crusade once the machinery was in motion. The emotional and ideological reorientation of the crusading movement toward Jerusalem, rather than Constantinople or Anatolia, occurred in stages during the winter of 1095 to 1096, and it is here that the absolute triumph of papal narrative over imperial pragmatism becomes most starkly visible. Urban II's original call, as recorded in the various accounts, never actually specified Jerusalem as the sole objective. It spoke generally of liberating the Eastern Christians and the holy places, a formula ambiguous enough to encompass everything from Nicaea to the Holy Sepulchre. But as the recruitment intensified, the popular imagination fixed on the supreme symbol of the Christian faith, the tomb of Christ, the very center of the world on medieval Mappamundi, where the heavenly Jerusalem touched the earthly. Pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre had been growing in popularity for 2 centuries, and the crusade was framed as an armed pilgrimage, with all the spiritual privileges of a penitential journey plus the glory of battle. The papal indulgence was specifically attached to the act of reaching and liberating Jerusalem, not to any lesser goal, and this effectively sidelined Alexios's strategic objectives. When the Crusader princes discussed their plans among themselves, the impact of the crusade on the Byzantine treasury and the administrative apparatus was immediate and severe, even before the main armies arrived. Alexios was forced to debase the gold nomisma, the empire's coinage that had been stable for centuries, in order to mint enough hyperpera to buy the grain, salt pork, and wine needed to feed the first waves of pilgrims. The imperial granaries in Constantinople, Thessalonica, and Radestos were opened and depleted. Special markets were established outside the walls of the capital where the Crusaders could purchase goods at regulated prices, guarded by Varangian axemen to prevent rioting. The emperor's aunt, the formidable Anna Damascene, who acted as regent in his absence, directed the distribution of the silk and gold gifts that Byzantine diplomacy traditionally used to pacify dangerous visitors. Each crusader leader who arrived was invited to the great palace, treated to the mechanical wonders of the Magnoria, the golden lions that roared, the singing birds and bronze trees, and presented with precious relics and purses of gold, while the emperor patiently explained, through interpreters, the terms of the oath of fealty he would require before transporting them across the Bosphorus. This oath, a formal recognition of Alexios's suzerainty over any former imperial territories that might be recovered, was the cornerstone of his strategy to control the crusade, and it would be the rock on which the entire relationship between Byzantines and Crusaders would splinter. The negotiations over this oath, conducted in Latin, Greek, and sometimes Norman French, revealed the chasm of mistrust. The Latins saw it as a feudal bond that limited their freedom of conquest, while Alexios saw it as the irreducible minimum condition for risking his fleet and his supplies on their behalf. The tragedy of Alexios I Komnenos is that he was perhaps the most capable emperor to sit on the Byzantine throne since Basil II the Bulgar Slayer, but he was grappling with forces beyond any one ruler's capacity to control. He had saved the empire from the abyss after Manzikert, reconstituting the army, reforming the coinage, and defeating a series of invasions from Normans, Pecheneg, and Serbs. His diplomatic acumen had turned potential enemies into temporary allies and bought the empire decades of breathing room. The letter to Urban II was, in this context, a rational and proportionate response to a specific military deficiency. The empire lacked heavy shock cavalry, and the Franks had it in abundance. If Urban had responded by facilitating the recruitment of 500 knights under an imperial general, the history of the 12th century would have been entirely different. But the Pope was not an employment agency for Byzantine generals. He was a revolutionary ideologue building a new order of papal monarchy, and Alexios's perfectly sensible request was the perfect instrument for his grand design. The irony, which would become brutally clear in the coming months as the Crusader hordes gathered at the Golden Horn, was that the emperor had called for a scalpel and received a battle-axe, a tool so large and unwieldy that it could smash the surgeon's own hand along with the disease it was meant to cut out. The second chapter thus closes with Constantinople tense and watchful, its emperor standing on the walls, watching the dust clouds of the approaching Crusader hosts, and beginning to realize that the history of the world had already pivoted on the words of a single, desperate letter. The day was Tuesday, November 27, 1095, and the low winter sun cast long shadows across the field just east of the town of Clermont in the mountainous Auvergne region of central France. A wooden platform draped in precious cloths had been erected in the open air because the Cathedral of Notre Dame du Port could not possibly accommodate the multitudes who had journeyed from across the kingdom. Crowds estimated by contemporaries at several thousand, bishops in their mitres, abbots with their croziers, knights in mail, townsmen in woolen tunics, peasants barefoot, packed the slope, crushed together in a breathing, murmuring mass, the air thick with expectation and the raw scent of thousands of bodies in a November chill. Urban II, the 159th Pope of the Roman Church, ascended the platform not in the humility of a penitent but in the full majesty of papal authority, wearing the white woolen pallium marked with black crosses, his head crowned by the papal tiara, surrounded by the archbishops of Reims, Bourges, Lyons, and senators. Silence fell as the pontiff raised his hand. And in that crystalline moment before the first words left his lips, the fate of Europe and the Middle East hung in the balance, because Urban was about to transform Alexios I's calculated plea for mercenaries into the most potent and destructive idea of the medieval world, that the shedding of blood in the name of Christ was not merely permissible but sacred. This chapter will recreate that epical speech in granular detail, analyze its rhetorical architecture, and trace the instantaneous explosion of crusading fervor that it ignited, revealing how a single oration redirected the entire course of history. The speech itself, as reconstructed from the four major chroniclers who were either present or interviewed eyewitnesses, Fulcher of Chartres, who accompanied the crusade, Robert the monk, who wrote a generation later, Baldric, Bishop of Dole, and Guibert of Nogent, was not a spontaneous outburst but a carefully crafted piece of ecclesiastical rhetoric, blending scriptural exegesis, papal authority, and raw emotional appeal. Urban began by addressing the Franks, a people he knew intimately, using the collective identity that tied the audience together. Dearest brethren, you Franks, you people beyond the mountains, chosen and beloved by God, as is manifest from your many works. The opening was a flattery of national pride, and it established the Franks as a new chosen people, the elect of the Lord whose duty it was to redress the wrongs committed in the East. The Pope immediately launched into a graphic description of the situation of the Eastern Christians, painting a picture of unspeakable atrocities: the Turks and Persians. An accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, had invaded the lands of the Romans and carried off the spoils. They had slaughtered and led away captives, destroyed churches, and devastated the kingdom of God. Urban described how they circumcised Christian men and poured their blood on altars or into baptismal fonts, how they dragged boys and girls into forced conversion and unspeakable sexual slavery, how they flayed pilgrims alive and used the hollowed bodies as wineskins. These details, almost certainly embellished, went far beyond anything Alexios had said. The emperor had never accused the Turks of systematic flaying or ritual blood drinking. Urban was deliberately inflating the horror to create a moral imperative so overwhelming that no knight could sit idle without losing his honor and his soul. The rhetorical pivot of the speech came when Urban expanded the geography of the crisis from the narrow frontier of Anatolia to the universal epicenter of Christian faith, the city of Jerusalem. The Pope thundered that the Holy Sepulchre, the very tomb of Christ, was in the hands of the infidel, and that the infidel had set up altars to their false prophet over the very rocks of Golgotha. He recalled the glorious memory of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor who had crushed the pagan Saxons and brought Christianity by the sword. He invoked the heroic biblical warriors of the Old Testament, Joshua and David and the Maccabees, who had cleansed the holy places with righteous blood. Then, in the climactic passage that would echo to a medieval mind burdened by the weight of sin, facing thousands of years in purgatory according to the penitential tariffs, this was a cosmic transaction of unimaginable value. Urban had transformed the crusade from a military expedition into a sacrament, a holy act that sanctified the warrior, and in so doing he had completely obliterated Alexios's limited, transactional framing. The immediate reaction of the crowd at Clermont was a spontaneous eruption of mass hysteria that the chroniclers describe in vivid, almost ecstatic language. Even before Urban had finished speaking, a great cry went up from the entire assembly. Deus vult! God wills it! The words were not planned. They erupted from the collective throat like the roar of a cataract, and the Pope himself, seizing the divine imprimatur, immediately declared that this very shout should be the battle cry of the army of God. Men fell to their knees weeping, tearing strips from their own cloaks, and begging the bishops to sew them onto their shoulders in the form of the cross. The red cross, a square of cloth, was from that moment the badge of the Crusader, a visible mark of the vow that separated those destined for glory from those who remained behind in the lukewarm security of home. Adhemer of Montail, the Bishop of Le Puy, was the first magnate to kneel before Urban and receive the cross, followed by hundreds of knights who pressed forward, their faces wet with tears, their swords suddenly transformed from the tools of petty feuds into the instruments of God's vengeance. The Pope, weeping himself according to some accounts, blessed the multitude and extended the indulgences to all who took the vow, and then the entire assembly processed back into the cathedral to sing the Te Deum, the ancient hymn of thanksgiving, while the bells of Clermont rang out across the mountains like the voice of a new age being born. The theological machinery behind the indulgence was a product of centuries of doctrinal evolution that had reached a critical mass in the late 11th century. Since the early Church, the concept of penance had required sinners to perform works of satisfaction, fasting, prayers, pilgrimages, almsgiving, proportional to the gravity of their sins, as part of the sacrament of reconciliation. By the time of the Gregorian Reform, theologians had distinguished between the guilt of sin, forgiven by confession, and the temporal punishment that remained even after absolution, which had to be worked off in this life or in purgatory. The practice of commuting penances, allowing a difficult pilgrimage to substitute for years of fasting, had opened the door to the idea that a supremely meritorious act could satisfy all penance in one stroke. Urban II, advised by the canon lawyer and future Pope Paschal II, extended this logic to its limit. The armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a journey of immense hardship and mortal danger, was itself a supererogatory work of such power that it could replace all other penances, applying the surplus merit of the saints from the treasury of the Church. This was a breathtaking expansion of papal authority, effectively claiming that the Pope held the keys to purgatory and could release souls from its torments by the simple act of blessing a military venture. Alexios, whose orthodox tradition viewed war as a necessary evil but never a holy act, had no cultural framework to understand this. In Byzantium, a soldier who killed in battle was still required to abstain from communion for a period of penance, because the act of taking life, even in a just war, was a stain on the soul. The crusading indulgence was not just a different policy, it was a different world. The news of Clermont spread through Western Christendom with a speed that modern communications can barely appreciate, considering the complete absence of mass media, yet it demonstrates the dense network of episcopal couriers, monastic letter writers, and itinerant preachers that the Gregorian papacy had built. Urban himself dispatched circular letters to the archbishops of every province, commanding them to proclaim the crusade in every parish church on certain feast days, and these letters were copied by monastic scriptoria and distributed along the pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed Europe. Within weeks, the message had reached the courts of the great feudal lords, Godfrey of Bouillon in Lower Lorraine, whose uncle had been a papal legate, Raymond of St. Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, whose Provençal lordship was a center of reformist monasticism and who had fought in Spain against the Muslims, Robert Curhose, the dissolute Duke of Normandy, who pawned his duchy to his brother William Rufus of England for 10,000 silver marks to finance his participation, and Bohemond of Taranto, the towering, honey-tongued Norman warlord who was besieging Amalfi when he heard the news and immediately cut his scarlet cloak into crosses for his followers, seeing in the crusade a chance to repeat his father's dream of conquering a Byzantine Empire, this time, perhaps, the empire itself. Each of these princes brought not just personal ambition but a vast feudal network of vassals and relatives, creating a fractal structure of recruitment that multiplied the original call into a host of 30,000 to 40,000 armed effectives, depending on which modern estimate one favors. The less organized but no less potent phenomenon of the popular preachers began almost simultaneously, and it was these unauthorized evangelists who most thoroughly distorted Alexios's original plea into an apocalyptic folk movement. The most famous, of course, was Peter the Hermit, a diminutive, barefoot, emaciated monk from Picardy who wore a filthy woolen cloak and rode a donkey that people believed to be a holy animal. Peter had, according to his own later account, been on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem years before and had been beaten by the Turks and forced to pay a toll, and he had had a vision in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in which Christ appeared to him, and gave him a letter commanding him to rouse the Christians of the West. Whether this was true or a later invention, Peter's charismatic preaching drew enormous crowds, and he claimed to have a personal commission from the Pope, though Urban never officially endorsed him. He was a master of the emotional sermon, describing the torments of the pilgrims with such raw passion that whole villages emptied to follow him, selling their few belongings and sewing red crosses onto the shoulders of their ragged tunics. The army that formed around Peter was not a feudal levy but a migration of the poor, peasants, artisans, women, children, the elderly, driven by a mixture of millenarian expectation, economic desperation, and genuine piety. They sang crusade hymns, carried relics and holy banners, and believed that the very walls of the infidel cities would fall like those of Jericho when they processed around them singing. This was not the disciplined mercenary force that Alexios had envisioned. It was the Book of Exodus reenacted on the roads of Europe. The dark side of the crusading fervor manifested almost immediately in the horrific pogroms against the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, a series of massacres that the papacy either sanctioned nor could prevent, and that revealed the latent anti-Semitism that the crusading ideology could unleash. In the spring of 1096, as the People's Crusade gathered in northern France and the German lands, bands of crusaders led by minor knights such as Emicho of Leiningen and Count Dithmar began to argue that if they were to march to the east to kill the enemies of Christ, why should they not first destroy the enemies of Christ who lived among them? The Jewish communities of Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, some of the most ancient and learned in Europe, were suddenly besieged by mobs of crusaders, often joined by local burghers eager to confiscate Jewish wealth. The Bishop of Speyer, John, bravely sheltered the Jews in his palace, but in Worms the entire community was butchered. In Mainz, the Archbishop Rahard fled after failing to protect the 1,000 Jews who took refuge in his palace, and the entire community was slaughtered, with mothers killing their own children to prevent forced baptism and the crusaders singing hymns as they cut throats. Over 1,000 Jews died in Mainz alone, and the chronicler Solomon Bar Simpson records that the crusaders promised each other to kill all Jews, young and old, and wipe the name of Israel from the earth. Alexios, hearing these reports, must have been appalled. His empire had contained a large and generally protected Jewish population for centuries, and the news that his Christian allies were committing genocide in God's name would have only deepened his suspicion that the crusade was not a holy army but a force of chaotic. The logistics of the crusading vow itself created a social and legal revolution that Alexios had never factored into his request. When a knight took the cross, he was granted the ecclesiastical protection known as the Truce of God, extended into a permanent immunity. His lands and family were placed under the direct guardianship of the local bishop. His lawsuits were suspended. His debts to Jews and Christians alike were frozen without interest. This effectively removed the crusader from the normal obligations of feudal society and created a class of temporarily sanctified warriors who existed outside the usual hierarchies, answerable only to the Pope and their own sworn oath to God. The financial arrangements were equally transformative. Lords liquidated their estates, selling them to monasteries or richer relatives at deflated prices. The Domesday Book later records the massive transfer of lands in England from departing Norman knights to the church and crown. The silver and gold that poured into the crusading coffers was used to buy armor, war horses, pack mules, and the great siege engines necessary for cracking the walls of Middle Eastern fortresses. But it also created a speculative bubble, an inflationary pressure on the economy of Europe that would be felt for decades. The crusade was not merely a military event, it was an economic earthquake, and the tremors from this earthquake would reach Constantinople in the form of thousands of armed spendthrifts demanding food, transport, and booty. The passage of the Crusader armies through Byzantine territory would begin in earnest in the late summer of 1096. But already Alexios' intelligence service was flooding the imperial palace with reports from the provincial dukes about the size, temper, and intentions of the approaching Franks. The Byzantine spy network, which included merchants, priests, and paid informants from the Latin kingdoms, was one of the most sophisticated in the medieval world, and the emperor was receiving detailed accounts of the recruitment levels in France, the quarrels among the princes, and the staggering numbers of non-combatants accompanying the armies. The reports made clear that this was no mere mercenary enterprise. Entire families were on the move, including heavily armed women who fought alongside their husbands, and a huge train of clerics, blacksmiths, and merchants. The numbers were so vast that Alexios Logothetes Tundraman, the chief minister for communications and foreign affairs, estimated that they would need to provision a moving city of over 50,000 people for months, which would require over 2,000 tons of grain, 5,000 amphorae of wine, and tens of thousands of head of livestock to be collected and distributed along the Via Egnatia before the columns even arrived. The empire's administrative machine, still the most efficient in Europe, was cranked into high gear, but the strain was immense, and the seeds of friction were already being sown. The Crusaders, used to the unregulated foraging of Western warfare, would clash with the Byzantine tax collectors and market officials who expected them to pay for everything at official rates. The Council of Clermont was the fulcrum on which the medieval world turned, the moment when the letter of an Eastern emperor and the ambition of a Western pope crystallized into a new force in history. Urban II had deliberately created an institution, the armed pilgrimage under papal indulgence, that outlasted his own papacy, because he had tied it not to any particular political situation but to the eternal state of the Christian soul. The crusading movement would continue for centuries, spawning a dozen major expeditions, a permanent Latin kingdom in the Holy Land, the military orders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, and eventually the tragic diversion into the sack of Constantinople itself in 1204. But in the winter of 1095, none of this was visible yet, only the intoxicating, terrifying enthusiasm of a people who believed they had been given a direct command from God. And in the great palace, across the sea and the mountains, Alexios I Komnenos was staring at the reports and the maps, realizing that the force he had called for was not going to be a surgical knife but a storm, a divine wind that would sweep away his carefully laid plans and remake the world in fire and blood. The third chapter thus concludes with the crusade born, the cross adopted, and the emperor waiting, the letter that had. The summer of 1096 brought to the Byzantine frontiers a human tide unlike anything the empire had witnessed since the great barbarian migrations that had swamped the Western Roman Empire 7 centuries earlier. The first to arrive was not the disciplined column of a princely army but a vast, shambolic mass of humanity later named the People's Crusade, a term that barely conveys the desperation, the faith, and the catastrophic naivety of the tens of thousands who followed Peter the Hermit and Walter Sans of Loire. In this chapter we will walk step by step through the tragic, chaotic, and ultimately doomed journey of these first crusaders, examining their passage through Hungary, the bloody clashes at Semlin and Belgrade, their fraught arrival in Constantinople, and the disastrous decision to cross the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, which culminated in the slaughter at the fortress of Zerigordos and the final, pitiless ambush at Civitate. Every one of these events was a direct consequence of the uncontrollable energy that Alexios I's letter had inadvertently released, and the emperor's frantic attempts to manage the unmanageable form a story of diplomatic genius confronted with the raw, chaotic force of popular apocalypticism that even he could not bend to his will. The man at the spiritual heart of this movement, Peter the Hermit, was a figure so strange and compelling that the chroniclers struggled to categorize him. Anna Komnene, who met him personally, describes him as a short, thin man with a sallow complexion, dressed in a coarse woolen garment that was never washed, his bare feet calloused into hooves, his eyes burning with a feverish light. He claimed to have been a soldier in his youth, then a hermit in the forests of northern France, then a pilgrim to Jerusalem, where he had been imprisoned and tortured by the Seljuk authorities before being miraculously released through a vision of the Lord. Anna, ever the skeptic, suspected that Peter was a cunning manipulator who feigned poverty to attract followers, but there is no doubt that he possessed a hypnotic charismatic power. When he preached in the fields of Champagne and Flanders, entire villages emptied, and the poor sold their livestock, their tools, even their land, to follow him. The movement he led was not a military force in any conventional sense. It was a penitential procession, a wandering city of 20,000 or more souls, including women, children, old people, and entire families, all convinced that the end of days was approaching and that the Holy Sepulchre must be purified for the second coming. Peter himself rode a donkey that some believed to be the very beast that had carried Christ into Jerusalem, and his followers treated the donkey's hair as a relic, pulling it out to make amulets. The vanguard of the People's Crusade, however, was commanded not by Peter but by a minor French nobleman named Walter Sans of Loire, whose surname means without possessions, a fitting epithet for a knight so impoverished that his entire contingent consisted of only a handful of horsemen and perhaps 5,000 foot soldiers. Walter's band left France ahead of Peter's main body and marched with considerable discipline through Germany and into Hungary, arriving at the Hungarian border town of Semlin in May 1096. The King of Hungary, Colomend the Learned, had been warned by Urban II's letters to allow the Crusaders free passage, but the sheer number and rapacious hunger of the Franks strained the local resources to the breaking point. For a while, the crossing proceeded peacefully. The Hungarians sold food at reasonable prices, and the Crusaders kept to the main road along the Danube, their crosses held high. But at Semlin, a dispute erupted that would set a bloody precedent. Some of Walter's men, driven by hunger, broke into the town to forage, and the Hungarian garrison reacted with force, killing several Franks and nailing their bodies to crosses as a warning. Walter himself managed to calm the situation and continue on to the Byzantine frontier fortress of Belgrade, but the bodies on the crosses inflamed the later arrivals, and the seeds of massacre were already planted in the rich earth of the Danube Valley. The main body of the People's Crusade, at Cologne, the Crusader army split into several columns, and one of these, led by the notorious Count Emicho of Leiningen, a brigand with a Crusader's cross sewn to his tunic, systematically attacked the Jewish quarters of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz in May and June 1096, committing atrocities that the Hebrew Chronicles record with harrowing precision. Families burned alive in their synagogues. Children snatched from their mothers' arms and baptized in the river before being murdered, rabbis disemboweled and their scrolls used as kindling. Peter the Hermit was already far down the Danube by the time the worst of these massacres occurred, but the news of the Rhineland pogroms traveled fast, and when his column approached the Hungarian border, the local authorities were understandably terrified, having heard that the Crusaders were not holy pilgrims, but homicidal maniacs. This poisoned atmosphere directly contributed to the disaster that unfolded at the Hungarian fortress of Zemun, directly across the Sava River from Byzantine Belgrade. The crossing of the Hungarian frontier into Byzantine territory took place in late June 1096, and it immediately exposed the deep cultural incompatibility between the Crusaders and the sophisticated imperial administration they expected to receive them with open arms and full bellies. Peter's horde descended on Zemun, where the local Hungarian governor, fearing a repetition of the Rhineland atrocities, had ordered the walls manned and the gates barred. The Crusaders, ragged and hungry, saw the closed gates as an act of war rather than prudence, and when a quarrel broke out over the theft of a pair of shoes from a market stall, the situation exploded. The chronicler Albert of Aachen, our best source for these events, relates that the Franks stormed the fortress, overwhelmed the garrison, and massacred several thousand Hungarian soldiers and civilians in a fit of collective frenzy that lasted for hours. The great cry of "Deus vult!" was heard again, but this time the blood it consecrated was Christian blood, spilled on the banks of the Danube in a paroxysm of violence that horrified the Byzantine observers watching from the ramparts of Belgrade across the river. The imperial governor of Belgrade, Nicetas, had no idea how to respond to this swarm of armed, unpredictable pilgrims who had just sacked a friendly Christian stronghold. He evacuated the civilian population to the hills and waited, sending urgent messages to Constantinople requesting instructions from the emperor himself. Alexios' response to the news from Zemun and the impending arrival of Peter's army was a masterclass in crisis management, though it reveals his deep-seated assumption that the Crusaders could be handled like any other barbarian embassy. He dispatched his most trusted general and relative, John Komnenos, the Duke of Dyrrhachium, and ordered him to assemble a large flotilla of transport ships at the Bosphorus to ferry the pilgrims across the strait into Asia as quickly as possible, effectively getting them out of Europe before they could cause more damage to the empire's heartland. The emperor also ordered the activation of the imperial grain reserves at Adrianople and Salimbria, dispatching hundreds of ox carts loaded with wheat, barley, and dried meat to meet the Crusader column on the road to Constantinople, hoping that a full stomach would calm their ferocious spirits. At the same time, he sent a personal envoy, a eunuch official named George Paleologus, to meet Peter on the march and convey a message that was part welcome, part warning. The emperor was overjoyed to receive such zealous Christian warriors, but they must promise to wait for the main armies of the princes before engaging the Turks, and they must respect the property and persons of the empire's subjects. Peter, awed by the splendor of the Byzantine embassy and mindful of his own precarious position, agreed to these conditions with apparent sincerity, and the column resumed its march with a new, if temporary, discipline, crossing the rolling hills of Thrace under the watchful eyes of Byzantine mounted scouts who ensured they stayed on the designated road. When the People's Crusade finally sighted the walls of Constantinople in the first days of August 1096, the reaction of the pilgrims was a mixture of awe, greed, and millenarian ecstasy that overwhelmed their already fragile self-control. The triple Theodosian walls, 40 feet high and studded with 96 towers, stretched for 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, gleaming with marble and limestone, the greatest fortification in the known world. Beyond them rose the domes of 1,000 churches. For peasants who had never seen a town larger than Amiens, it was a vision so overpowering that many fell to their knees and wept, believing they had already reached the holy city. Peter the Hermit was immediately summoned to the imperial court, where he knelt before Alexios I in the Chrysotraklinos, the golden reception hall of the palace, its walls encrusted with mosaics of Christ and the emperors. Anna Komnenos records the interview with evident disdain. Peter spoke at length about his visions and his mission, while Alexios, wearing the full imperial regalia, listened patiently and then gave the hermit a purse of gold, a pile of silver coins for his followers, and a firm command to cross the Bosphorus immediately and camp on the Asian shore at a place called Kabotos, known to the Latins as Civitate, where a former Byzantine military camp could provide basic shelter and water. The emperor, still hoping to minimize the damage, also assigned a small unit of Pecheneг scouts to keep an eye on the Crusaders and, theoretically, to guide them back to safety if they got into trouble. The camp at Civitate, on the southern shore of the Gulf of Nicomedia, was a desolate strip of rocky beach backed by low hills, with an ancient fortress that the Byzantines had used as a supply depot. It was here that the fragile unity of the People's Crusade disintegrated completely, splintering into dozens of competing bands, each led by a charismatic preacher or a minor knight with no authority over anyone else. The French contingent, the largest and most unruly, refused to listen to Peter, who was increasingly seen as a puppet of the Greek emperor, and they elected their own leaders, including a knight named Renaud of Braise and a priest named Godfrey Burel, who agitated for immediate advance into Turkish territory to seize the great city of Nicaea and its fabled treasures. The Lombard and German contingents, who spoke different languages and distrusted the French, formed their own separate camps, and a chaotic democracy of mob opinion replaced any chain of command. Food supplies from Constantinople, though generous, were irregular, and the Crusaders began to raid the surrounding countryside, sacking Orthodox Christian villages that Alexios had promised to protect, kidnapping Greek children and selling them into slavery in exchange for weapons and horses from Italian merchants who had followed the crusade like vultures. The emperor's worst nightmare was materializing. The army he had summoned was now an occupying force of starving, fanatical terrorists operating on his own soil, and every atrocity they committed stoked the resentment of the local population and undermined Alexios's authority among his own subjects. The fatal decision to launch a raid into Seljuk territory without waiting for the princes was taken by a faction of the French knights, spurred on by the fiery sermons of Godfrey Burel and the ambition of Renaud of Braise, who dreamed of winning glory and spoils before the great lords arrived to steal the credit. Against Peter's frantic objections, a force of approximately 6,000 foot soldiers and a few hundred poorly mounted knights, many riding pack mules rather than war horses, marched out of the camp in late September 1096, heading east along the southern shore of the Gulf of Nicomedia toward the city of Nicaea, the capital of Sultan Kilij Arslan I. The Byzantine Pecheneг scouts, fulfilling their orders, accompanied the column but refused to participate in the actual attack, remaining on the heights to observe. The Crusaders, singing hymns and waving their makeshift crosses, were in high spirits, convinced that God would deliver the infidel city into their hands as effortlessly as he had toppled the walls of Jericho. They bypassed Nicaea itself, recognizing their inability to besiege its formidable double walls, and instead attacked a small Seljuk outpost called Zaragordos, an isolated fortress perched on a rocky hill overlooking a dry valley. The garrison, surprised and outnumbered, fled, and the Crusaders captured the castle along with its precious water cisterns and a large herd of sheep and cattle that the Turks had been grazing nearby. It was their first victory, and it would be their last. Zaragordos became a trap of nightmarish proportions, a hell of thirst and fire that the chroniclers describe with a horror that still resonates 9 centuries later. The Crusaders, drunk on their easy victory, settled into the fortress for several days, slaughtering the captured livestock and feasting, not realizing that Kilij Arslan had received reports of their incursion and had personally mobilized a large force of several thousand Seljuk horse archers, the finest light cavalry in the world, from his camp at Nicaea. The Sultan, a young warrior in his mid-20s who had already defeated several Byzantine armies, understood immediately that these Frankish raiders were not the disciplined heavy cavalry he feared but a disorganized mob that could be destroyed piecemeal. He surrounded Zerigordos with his mounted archers, cutting off all access to the spring outside the walls and leaving the Crusaders with only the cisterns inside the fortress, which quickly ran dry under the merciless Anatolian sun. For 8 days, the Franks suffered tortures that exceeded anything they had imagined the Turks capable of. According to Albert of Aachen, they drank the blood of their own horses and donkeys, then their own urine, then the moisture from the fresh-cut hides of their dead animals. Some, in desperation, opened the veins of their comrades to drink the blood while it was still warm. Men died of thirst with their mouths caked in mud, their tongues swollen and black, while the Turkish arrows rained down on the walls every time a head appeared. Renaud of Braise and a group of knights managed to escape by night and fight their way back to Civitate, but the bulk of the expedition perished, and the fortress fell. Those who survived were taken into slavery, and many were offered the choice of conversion or death, a choice that the Crusaders had not offered to the Jews of the Rhine. The horror at Zerigordos should have been a warning, but the chaos at Civitate was such that the news only inflamed the fanaticism of the Crusader camp. The survivors who staggered back told tales of Turkish atrocities that, however exaggerated by trauma, were seized upon by the preachers as proof that the infidel was the very spawn of Satan and that a great battle must be fought immediately to avenge the martyrs. Peter the Hermit, who had left the camp to travel to Constantinople and beg for more supplies from Alexios, was not present to restrain the mob, and Godfrey Burel and other zealots took control, demanding an immediate march against the Turks. The Byzantine Pecheneg commander, who had been instructed by Alexios to keep the Crusaders in the camp at all costs, sent frantic warnings that the Sultan had an army of 15,000 horse archers waiting in ambush along the Nicaea road, and that the Franks would be slaughtered if they advanced without the heavy cavalry of the princes. The Crusaders denounced the Byzantines as traitors and liars, claimed that the Greeks were conspiring with the Turks, and on October 21, 1096, the entire camp marched out, some 20,000 men, women, and children, in a vast, ragged column that stretched for miles, singing the Kyrie eleison and convinced that the very sight of their crosses would cause the infidel army to dissolve into mist. The Turkish ambush that followed at the defile near the Dragon Fountain, a narrow pass between wooded hills about 3 miles from the camp, was a massacre so total and so swift that it left a permanent scar on the collective memory of the Crusade. Kilij Arslan had positioned his archers on both sides of the pass, their composite bows ready, their quivers full of bodkin-pointed arrows designed to pierce the cloth armor of the peasants. As the Crusader column funneled into the bottleneck, the first volley of arrows fell like a black hail, and the front ranks dissolved in an instant, the wounded screaming as they fell and were trampled by the terrified ranks behind them. The Turks, on their nimble Arabian ponies, rode in close to loose their shafts and then retreated just out of reach, their war cries echoing off the hills, while the panicked Crusaders, who had no cavalry screen and no formation, broke and ran in every direction. The Seljuk horsemen rode among the fleeing masses, cutting down knights and peasants alike with curved scimitars, and the ground became a churning swamp of blood and entrails. Walter Sansavuar, who had tried to organize a defense, was struck by 7 arrows and died in a ditch. His body never recovered. The chroniclers record that the Turks spared only the young girls and the boys who might be sold as. The consequences of the annihilation of the People's Crusade ricocheted through both the Byzantine court and the approaching princely armies, reshaping the psychology of the entire enterprise. For Alexios, the disaster was a grim vindication of his fears and a diplomatic disaster. The Crusader survivors, now huddled in a refugee camp outside Constantinople, filled the city with tales of Greek treachery, claiming that the emperor and his Pecheneg scouts had deliberately led them into a trap. These accusations, however false, took deep root among the Latins and would later be used by Bohemond and others to justify their own breaches of the oaths of fealty. For Kilij Arslan, the victory was so total that it lulled him into a fatal overconfidence. He assumed that all Frankish armies were as feeble as the ragtag peasants he had just butchered, and he withdrew his main forces eastward to fight the Danish Mandemir over the city of Melitene, leaving Nicaea dangerously undermanned when the real Crusader armies arrived the following spring. For the princes who heard the news as they marched through the Balkans, the fate of Walter Sansavuar and Peter's flock served as both a sobering lesson in Turkish military prowess and a goad to vengeance, hardening their resolve but also deepening their suspicion of the Byzantines whose lands they were now crossing. And for Peter the Hermit himself, who was received back in Constantinople with charity by the emperor, the aura of divine invincibility was shattered. He was no longer a prophet leading the people of God, but a broken man who would accompany the princely armies as a mere shadow of his former self, a living reminder of the terrible cost of launching a holy war without a plan. The fourth chapter ends here, with the bones of 17,000 crusaders whitening in the defile of the Dragon Fountain and the emperor staring at the reports, knowing that the worst was yet to come, because the princes were only weeks away, and they would not be so easily destroyed. The winter of 1096 to 1097 saw the four great armies of what would later be called the Prince's Crusade converging on Constantinople from different routes, each a sovereign force under its own lord, each trailing a comet's tail of vassals, infantry, priests, and non-combatant followers, each arriving with a complex agenda shaped by years of dynastic politics, and each fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the man they were about to meet, Alexios I Komnenos, the emperor who had asked for 500 knights and who was now forced to host over 40,000. This chapter will meticulously dissect the arrival and negotiations of the main Crusader leaders: Hugh of Vermandois, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and the remaining northern French contingents, and it will expose the web of oaths, bribes, threats, and bewildering Byzantine ceremonial that Alexios deployed in his desperate attempt to bind these potentates to his own strategic goals. Every conversation, every meal in the great palace, every tense standoff outside the walls was a battle and a diplomatic war that would determine whether the crusade would serve the empire or consume it, and the outcome would shape the entire future of the expedition and the Latin East. The first prince to arrive in Constantinople was Hugh of Vermandois, the younger brother of King Philip I of France, a man whose royal blood far exceeded his military experience, and whose crossing of the Adriatic in the autumn of 1096 provided a humiliating prelude to the imperial reception. Hugh had chartered a fleet of ships at Bari, but a storm scattered his squadron and wrecked his own vessel off the coast of Epirus, leaving the would-be crusader washed up on the shore near Dyrrhachium, drenched and shivering, having lost most of his possessions. The Byzantine governor of the city, Alexios' nephew John Komnenos, treated him with exquisite courtesy, providing fresh clothes, a retinue, and an escort to Constantinople. But Hugh's ignominious arrival set a tone of dependency. The Franks, for all their bluster, needed the imperial navy, imperial roads, and imperial supplies, and Alexios intended to make them acutely aware of that fact. When Hugh was brought before the emperor in the Blacherney palace, he was overwhelmed by the splendor of the court and the unnerving formality of the Byzantine protocol, and he quickly agreed to the standard oath of fealty that Alexios required of all the princes, a promise to restore to the empire any former imperial cities that the Crusaders might capture. Hugh's easy compliance, however, was a false dawn. The more powerful lords who followed would not be so pliable. Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, arrived next, in the week before Christmas 1096, leading a formidable army of Frankish and Walloon knights that had marched overland through Hungary and Bulgaria in a march marked by both discipline and, at times, terrifying violence when his men clashed with Byzantine border troops over foraging rights. Godfrey was a figure of immense piety and obstinacy. Tall, blond, immensely strong, he had sold or mortgaged much of his patrimony to fund his crusade, and he came with a reputation for rigid honor and a deep suspicion of the Greek schismatics. When he encamped his army at the suburb of Pera, across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, he refused to cross the strait and take the oath, even when Alexios cut off food supplies to his camp in a calculated pressure tactic. For days, the two sides played a dangerous game of brinkmanship. Godfrey's troops raided the outlying villages, capturing livestock and burning granaries, while the Byzantine Imperial Guard, the Varangians and the Excubators, formed up in battle array on the city walls, their axes and banners visible across the water. A skirmish even broke out on the bridge of the Cosmedian, where Godfrey's men crossed the river and were driven. The most psychologically complex and dangerous of all the negotiations was with Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince whose history with Alexios was written in blood on the battlefield of Dyrrhachium 15 years earlier. Bohemond was the eldest son of Robert Guiscard, the Norman adventurer who had carved out a kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily, and had invaded the Byzantine Balkans with the explicit goal of seizing Constantinople itself. The young Bohemond had led the Norman vanguard at Dyrrhachium and had personally crossed swords with Alexios' Varangian guard. Now, in April 1097, he stood in the same imperial palace, a giant of a man with a massive chest, broad shoulders, and a calculating intelligence that Anna Komnene describes in a remarkable passage. His stature was such that he towered above the tallest men, his chest was broad, his arms were thick and strong, his whole body was well proportioned, but he stooped a little. His skin was very white and his hair was light brown and did not hang down to his waist like that of other barbarians but was cut short over the ears. Bohemond had crossed the Adriatic with a smaller but highly disciplined Norman-Italian force, and he had deliberately kept his men on a tight leash during the march, punishing plunderers and paying for supplies, precisely because he wanted to present himself to Alexios as a potential ally and perhaps as a candidate for a high Byzantine military office, the rank of domestic of the East, the supreme command of the imperial armies in Asia, which he believed the emperor might grant him. Alexios, who could read ambition like a priest reads the Psalter, received Bohemond with elaborate honor, plying him with treasures of gold, silks, and relics, and the two men engaged in a subtle duel of charm and menace, each gauging the other's strength. In the end, Bohemond swore the oath of fealty with ostentatious enthusiasm, even urging the other princes to follow his example. But both he and the emperor knew that the vow was a sheet of vellum that could be torn in a moment if the strategic situation changed. Bohemond's long-term goal, which he concealed behind a mask of fraternal piety, was nothing less than to carve out a Norman principality in the Levant that would rival the empire he had failed to conquer in the West. The last and most stubborn of the great princes to negotiate with Alexios was Raymond IV of Toulouse, the Count of St. Gilles and the oldest, wealthiest, and most sincerely pious of the Crusader leaders. Raymond was a man in his mid-50s, with a lined, ascetic face and the fanatical gleam of a convert, because he had spent the last decade lavishing his vast Provençal fortune on monastic foundations and had personally sworn that he would die in the Holy Land. He had brought the largest army, perhaps 12,000 strong, and he was accompanied by the papal legate Heir of Montail, the Bishop of Le Puy, which gave his contingent a quasi-official status. Raymond's arrival in Constantinople, however, was marked by a series of diplomatic fiascos that revealed the chasm of mistrust between his faith and Alexios's pragmatism. The Count initially refused to meet the Emperor at all, camping his army on the outskirts and sending a haughty message that he would take no oath of homage to any mortal man, because his only liege was God and the Holy Sepulchre. Alexios, understanding that Raymond's piety made him both the most rigid and the most useful of the princes, deployed his full arsenal of psychological warfare. He invited the Count to a private audience, where the two men sat alone in a chamber hung with icons of the saints, and Alexios argued that the oath was not a feudal subjugation, but a brotherly compact to restore the common Christian inheritance. He offered Raymond the position of overall military commander, or at least the presidency of the Council of Princes, and he promised that the imperial forces under the General Tatikios, a eunuch of proven ability, would accompany the crusade and provide the vital engineering and logistical support that the Latins utterly lacked. Raymond, pressed by Heir, finally agreed. The strategic plan that Alexios hammered out with the assembled princes during these tense spring months was, at least on paper, a model of Byzantine strategic clarity. The immediate objective would be Nicaea, the Seljuk capital just 80 miles from Constantinople, whose recapture was the original, and perhaps the only, goal Alexios had ever truly wanted from the crusade. The city, with its formidable walls and its location on the Lake of Ascanius, would need a combined land and water operation. The Crusader army, now numbering approximately 30,000 combatants, would surround the landward walls, while a Byzantine fleet, dragged overland on rollers from the Gulf of Nicomedia, would be launched into the lake to cut the city's supply lines. Alexios promised to provide the stone-throwing trebuchets, the mangonels, the sappers, and the engineers, and he placed his trusted General Tatikios and a force of Byzantine heavy infantry and Pecheneg archers under the operational command of the Council of Princes, though with the clear understanding that all captured territory would be handed over to imperial officials. The emperor also secured from the princes a promise that any further advance into Anatolia would proceed along the old Roman military roads, the Via Sebaste and the Via Tauri, which were dotted with Byzantine fortresses that he was already secretly negotiating to resupply and garrison. The plan was, in essence, a pincer movement on an entire subcontinent, using the Crusader heavy cavalry as the mailed fist and the Byzantine administration as the net that would gather the conquered territory back into the empire. It was the realization, at last, of the original letter's vision, except that Alexios now had to manage not 500 mercenaries but a coalition of proud, rival, and mutually suspicious warlords who had already tasted the emperor's gold and found it sweet but not binding. The siege of Nicaea, which began in earnest in May 1097, was the first test of this fragile coalition, and it unfolded with a mixture of military brilliance and political tension that perfectly encapsulated the entire Byzantine-Crusader relationship. The Crusader army deployed in a great arc around the southern, eastern, and western walls, with Raymond of Toulouse on the south, Godfrey of Bouillon on the east, and Bohemond on the north, while the lake to the west remained open, allowing the Turkish garrison to receive supplies and reinforcements by boat. Kilij Arslan, who had underestimated the new Crusader threat after his easy victory over the People's Crusade, was campaigning far to the east against the Danishmends when the siege began. But he rushed back with his household cavalry and attempted to relieve the city by attacking Raymond's camp from the south. The battle that ensued on May 21st was a ferocious, swirling fight in the hills south of Nicaea, with the Provençal knights and infantry forming a shield wall that held against the Turkish horse archers while Bohemians Normans charged into their flank. The Sultan's forces were routed with heavy losses, and Kilij Arslan himself barely escaped, his pregnant wife and infant daughter falling into Crusader hands and being sent back to Constantinople as honored hostages. The victory demonstrated the crushing power of the Frankish heavy cavalry against the light Turkish horse when properly deployed, but it also showed the stark limitations of the Crusader army in siege warfare, Without the Byzantine engineers and the fleet, the walls of Nicaea, manned by a determined garrison, were practically impregnable. The mangonels that Alexios sent through stones day and night, and the great wooden towers, covered in soaked hides to protect against Greek fire, rolled toward the walls while the sappers dug tunnels beneath the foundations. Yet it was the Byzantine naval operation, the launching. The Crusaders were forbidden from entering the city except in small, supervised groups of 10, to prevent the sack and massacre that they had expected as their natural right of conquest. Bohemond and Raymond were furious. They had hoped to plunder Nicaea's legendary wealth, its silk bazaars, its golden-laid icons, and they saw Alexios's maneuver as a double cross. To soothe their anger, the emperor distributed a vast donative of gold, silver, and fine cloths to the Crusader leaders, and he allowed the common soldiers to purchase provisions at controlled prices. But the psychological damage was done. The Crusaders had bled on the walls of Nicaea and felt that the imperial bureaucrats had stolen their prize. The emperor, for his part, had achieved his primary objective, the restoration of the key fortress of Bithynia, and believed he had acted with perfect legitimacy and generosity. The mutual misunderstanding was complete, and it would only deepen as the army marched south. The advance across Anatolia in the summer of 1097 was a strategic triumph and a logistical nightmare that tested the Crusader coalition to its limits. Alexios, who did not accompany the crusade in person, remaining in Constantinople to govern the empire and, as some Crusaders suspected, to avoid the risks of the field, assigned the general Tatikios, a eunuch with a scarred face and a reputation for competence, to guide the army along the old Roman roads and ensure that the Byzantine supply depots were functioning. The Crusader army was divided into two columns to facilitate foraging. The northern column under Bohemond and Robert Curthose marched along the valley of the Gallus River, while the southern column under Raymond and Godfrey paralleled them a day's march to the south, through the rolling steppe of central Anatolia. The land was arid, the summer heat intense, and the Turkish horse archers constantly harassed the flanks and supply wagons, riding into loose volleys of arrows and then galloping away into the shimmering haze. The Crusaders' heavy horses, unused to the climate, died in droves, and the infantry struggled to march in their armor, discarding chain mail and helmets along the road to avoid heat stroke. Tatikios urged them to keep close formation and to avoid pursuing the feigned retreats. But the Frankish knights, bred for the charge, repeatedly broke ranks to chase the taunting Turks, only to be ambushed in the ravines. The tension between the need for Byzantine strategic caution and the Frankish hunger for the decisive charge was a direct replication, on a massive scale, of the fundamental miscalculation that Alexios's original letter had set in motion. The West wanted glory, the East wanted territory, and the two were only rarely compatible. The Battle of Dorylaeum, fought on July 1, 1097, was the crucible in which the Crusader army nearly shattered and, paradoxically, forged its own identity as an independent military power that no longer needed Byzantine guidance. Kilij Arslan, having gathered a huge coalition of Seljuk and Danish manned horse archers, perhaps as many as 30,000, fell upon Bohemond's separate. The march across the arid plateau of Anatolia after Dorylaeum was a slow-motion catastrophe of thirst, disease, and Turkish harassment that stripped away any remaining Crusader deference to Byzantine authority. The army had to cross the salt desert, the great white plain of Tuzgolu, under the August sun, with the water holes poisoned by the retreating Turks and the pack animals dropping dead by the hundreds every day. Tatikios advised the princes to follow the southern route, through the Taurus Mountains, where the Byzantine fortress of Heraclea and the city of Iconium could provide supplies. But the Crusaders, now suspicious of any Greek advice, grumbled that the eunuch was leading them into a trap. The situation was so desperate that knights who had once ridden fine war horses were now plodding along on foot, or riding oxen, or even being carried in litters by their remaining sergeants. The baby Baldwin, the younger brother of Godfrey, had lost all his mounts and famously threatened to mount a captured goat, to the macabre laughter of his companions. It was in this desperate march that the first open breach between Alexios's original plan and the Crusaders' ambitions occurred, triggered by the ambition of Baldwin of Boulogne himself, who, instead of following the main army to Antioch, decided to strike out eastward with a small force of knights toward the Armenian Christian Principality of Edessa, beyond the Euphrates. He had heard that the Armenian Prince Theuras, an Orthodox Christian who held the great city of Edessa, was old and childless and desired Frankish protection. Baldwin's occupation of Edessa in early 1098, his adoption by Theuras, and his subsequent usurpation of the city after Theuras was murdered by a mob, in which Baldwin was almost certainly complicit, was the first instance of a crusader carving out an independent lordship on former Byzantine imperial territory, the very thing Alexios's oath was designed to prevent. When Baldwin refused to render homage to the emperor or to return Edessa to the empire, Alexios's elaborate legal framework began to unravel, and the crusade mutated into something the emperor had never intended, a project of colonization. The Siege of Antioch, which began on October 20, 1097, and lasted for 8 agonizing months, was the grand climax of the Crusader-Byzantine alliance and its ultimate fracture, the point at which all the suppressed resentments, strategic divergences, and cultural misunderstandings boiled over into a permanent schism. The city of Antioch, the ancient capital of the Seleucid Empire and the seat of one of the original Christian patriarchates, had been lost to the Byzantines only 13 years earlier, in 1084, and its recovery was, after Nicaea, the second great objective of Alexios's Reconquista. The Crusader army, reduced to about 25,000 effectives, surrounded the city's 5 miles of towering, black basalt walls, built by the Emperor Justinian and strengthened by centuries of Byzantine and Arab rulers. But they were unable to fully blockade the city, because the massive citadel on Mount Silpius overlooked their camps and the eastern gate, the Gate of St. Paul, remained open. The ensuing siege was a nightmare of starvation, disease, and constant Turkish sorties that pushed the Crusaders to the very edge of disintegration. Alexios, meanwhile, was marching south from Constantinople with a large relief army, intending to join the siege and assert his personal command over the final assault, as the original agreement had stipulated. He had reached as far as Philomelion in central Anatolia when he met deserters from the Crusader camp, and they told him that the crusade was doomed, that the Turks were massing a vast army to relieve Antioch, and that the emperor's own forces would be annihilated if they continued. Alexios, a realist to the bone, made the most controversial decision of his career. He turned back, retreating to the safety of the plateau, judging that preserving his army was more important than dying gloriously in a lost cause. In the eyes of the Crusaders, who were unaware of the true situation at Alexios's rear, he was also threatened by a Pecheneg uprising. This retreat was an act of unforgivable betrayal, an abandonment of the Holy Army by the cowardly Greek. The date of the emperor's withdrawal, June 1098, just days. The final chapter of this extraordinary story traces the long and bitter sequel to the fall of Antioch, a sequel in which Alexios I Komnenos would spend the remaining 2 decades of his reign wrestling with the monster he had inadvertently created, while the Crusaders pressed on to Jerusalem and forged a network of Latin states that fundamentally redrew the political and religious map of the Eastern Mediterranean. This chapter will detail the climactic capture of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, and the horrific massacre that followed, the establishment of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem under Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin, the irreparable breach between Constantinople and the Crusader principalities, and the decades of Byzantine diplomacy and warfare that sought, with partial success, to reassert imperial authority over Antioch and the Cilician coast. We will also examine the personal cost to Alexios, the way his original miscalculation haunted his family, his legacy as recorded by his daughter Anna Komnene, and the ultimate historical verdict on a letter that had set in motion a chain of events stretching from the Rhineland pogroms to the sack of Constantinople itself in 1204, and beyond to the entire troubled relationship between the Islamic world and the Christian West. The Crusader army that marched south from Antioch in January 1099 was no longer the grand coalition that had knelt in the Blacherney Palace. It was a lean, desperate, and fanatical band of perhaps 12,000 fighting men, led by the surviving princes who had now explicitly repudiated their oaths to Alexios. Bohemond remained in Antioch, consolidating his new principality, and engaging in a series of frontier wars with the Byzantine general Tatikios and the local Armenian and Syrian Christian lords who still looked to Constantinople for protection. Raymond of Toulouse, who had passionately contested Bohemians' claim to Antioch, led the main army south along the Mediterranean coast, through the emirates of Tripoli, Beirut, and Sidon, meeting surprisingly little resistance because the local Muslim rulers, fragmented and fearful, preferred to pay ransom and supply the Franks rather than face their siege engines. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, which had only recently reconquered Jerusalem from the Turkish Artukids, attempted to negotiate with the Crusaders, offering them unmolested pilgrimage if they would come in peace and small numbers, but the Franks, now utterly committed to the conquest of the Holy City, rejected all terms. The journey along the coast, despite the absence of a major field army to oppose them, was still a crucible. The Crusaders suffered from heat, from the bites of poisonous spiders in the sand dunes, from the ambushes of Bedouin tribesmen who fell on stragglers, and from the constant, grinding hunger that reduced them to eating the flesh of their own dead horses and, in some documented cases, resorting to cannibalism among the corpses of fallen enemies. Yet the army was sustained by a mystical fervor that had now completely displaced any memory of the pragmatic mercenary project Alexios had originally funded. They were no longer fighting for an earthly emperor but for the crown of life, for the New Jerusalem, for the vision of the celestial city that blazed in their minds more vividly than the miserable reality of their starved bodies. The siege of Jerusalem, which began on June 7, 1099, was a race against time, water, and the approaching Fatimid relief army from Egypt, a desperate operation that succeeded through a combination of religious ecstasy, imported Genoese engineering, and sheer bloody-minded audacity. The Crusaders, numbering now about 1,300 knights and 12,000 foot, surrounded the Holy City on the northern and western sides, but they had no siege engines until the arrival of a Genoese fleet at Jaffa, whose crews were slaughtered by the Fatimid garrison, but whose ships were stripped of their timbers, nails, and ropes and dragged overland by teams of sweating pilgrims to build two massive wooden siege towers. The army was also tormented by thirst, because the cisterns inside the city were full, but the springs outside were few, and the Turks had poisoned the wells with dead animals and excrement. Men dug pits in the Kidron Valley and sucked the moisture from the mud, and the horses were so dehydrated that they could no longer be ridden. In this extremity, the Crusaders turned to the penitential rituals that the Byzantine Church would have found bizarre, and that Alexios would have seen as madness: a barefoot procession around the walls of Jerusalem, led by priests carrying relics and crosses, chanting psalms and crying out for divine intervention, while the Muslim defenders on the ramparts mocked them and held up crosses of their own, which they spat on and broke. The procession, far from being a mere show, was the psychological crucible that welded the Crusader army into a single instrument of terrifying purpose. On the night of July 13th to 14th, the two towers were rolled against the northern wall, near the gate of the column, and on the opposite side, near the Mount of Olives, while the sappers tunneled under the walls and set great fires of naphtha and sulfur. At noon on July 15th, the tower of Godfrey of Bouillon, the man who had once sworn the humiliating oath to Alexios and then chafed under it, made contact with the parapet, and the first Franks, led by the knight Ludolf of Tournai, leaped onto the walls of Jerusalem, opening the gates to the army. What followed was not a military victory in any classical sense. It was a massacre of such proportions that even the Crusader chroniclers, who normally celebrated the slaughter of infidels, described it with a kind of awestruck horror that still echoes through the centuries. The Gesta Francorum records that the amount of blood shed on that day is incredible, and that the Crusaders rode in blood up to their bridles. The population of Jerusalem, both Muslim and Jewish, had taken refuge in the mosques and synagogues, and the Crusaders moved systematically through the city, killing every man, woman, and child they could find. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the Temple Mount, the slaughter was so extensive that the bodies piled up to the height of a man, and the blood ran in rivers down the steps and into the courtyards. The personal tragedy of Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had been the most charismatic and dangerous of the Crusader leaders, and his final confrontation with Alexios, forms a kind of tragic coda to the story of the original letter. Bohemond, now styling himself Prince of Antioch, refused all imperial demands to hand over the city, and by 1104 he was actively planning to return to the west, raise a new army, and invade the Byzantine Balkans in a direct replay of his father's campaign. He crossed Italy, married Constance, the daughter of King Philip I of France, and toured the courts of Europe, presenting himself as the wronged hero of the crusade, betrayed by the treacherous Greeks, and he secured from Pope Paschal II a new crusade indulgence, this time directed against the Byzantine Empire rather than the Muslims. In 1107, Bohemond landed on the coast of Epirus with a massive fleet and army, and besieged the fortress of Dyrrhachium, the same city where he had fought Alexios a quarter century earlier. But the emperor, now an old man with a lifetime of military experience, was ready. He had fortified the city, stockpiled supplies, and using his customary strategy of avoiding pitched battle while harassing the Norman supply lines from the sea and the mountains, he slowly starved Bohemond's army into submission. In September 1108, the Treaty of Devil was signed, a document so humiliating that it essentially ended Bohemond's career. The Norman prince knelt before the emperor, swore a new oath of fealty in the most explicit terms, recognized Alexios as his lord and the suzerain of Antioch, accepted an imperial governor in the city, and even agreed to hold Antioch as an imperial fief that would revert to the empire upon his death. The treaty was a masterpiece of Byzantine diplomacy and a personal triumph for Alexios, but it was also a paper victory. Bohemond died in Italy 3 years later, and his nephew Tancred, who controlled Antioch in his absence, simply refused to honor the treaty, and the principality remained in Norman hands, a permanent thorn in the empire's side, until it was finally conquered by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars in 1268. The letter that had asked for 500 knights had now led to a century and a half of crusader states, of constant border wars, of deepening mutual hatred between Latin and Greek Christians, and ultimately to the catastrophe that Alexios could never have foreseen, but that was the logical conclusion of his miscalculation, the diversion of the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople in 1204. When the descendants of the very knights Alexios had summoned would storm the walls of the Queen of Cities, sack the Great Palace, desecrate Hagia Sophia, and set up a Latin emperor on the throne of Constantine. The seeds of 1204 were planted in that chancery in the year 1091. The final years of Alexios I Komnenos were consumed by the consequences of his letter, by the incessant demands of the Crusader states for help, by the intrigues of the papal legates who continued to treat the Orthodox Church as a schismatic sect to be subdued, and by the slow, grinding effort of rebuilding the imperial treasury and the Anatolian frontier with the limited resources that remained. He died on August 15, 1118, at the age of 62, in the purple-born chamber of the Mangana Palace, attended by his devoted wife Irene Ducana and his daughters, his body worn out by decades of campaigning and his mind still grappling with the geopolitical earthquake he had inadvertently triggered. His daughter Anna Komnene, who had watched the entire drama unfold from the imperial court, began writing her monumental history, the Alexiad, a work of filial piety and extraordinary historical insight that remains our greatest source for the events of this period. In its pages, Anna struggles to reconcile her father's undeniable greatness as a ruler with the catastrophic consequences of his call to the West. She portrays him as a hero betrayed by the barbarism and perfidy of the Latins, and she never quite admits that the original request itself was a colossal strategic error. Yet her account, read with a critical eye, is a treasure trove of detail and a poignant monument to a man who was perhaps the most capable emperor in 500 years, undone by the very brilliance of his own diplomatic maneuvering. The letter itself, if it still existed, would be the most important lost document of the Middle Ages. In the broader historical perspective, the appeal of Alexios I must be understood as the catalyst that transformed the latent energies of Latin Christendom, its reformed papacy, its warrior aristocracy, its pilgrimage piety, its economic dynamism, into a directed force that reshaped the Mediterranean world. The Crusades, as an institution, would outlast the Byzantine Empire itself, morphing from expeditions to the Holy Land into the Baltic Crusades of the Teutonic Knights, the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars of southern France, and the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, all of which claimed the legacy of Clermont and the Indulgence. The mental geography of Europe was permanently altered. The notion that the Pope had the authority to declare a holy war, to remit sins by the stroke of a pen, and to mobilize entire populations for a sacred mission, became embedded in the DNA of Western civilization, with echoes that can be heard, however distantly, in everything from the age of exploration to modern ideological crusades. And yet, at the origin of this entire torrent of history, there was a single moment in a candlelit chancery in the great palace of Constantinople, a tired emperor dictating a plea for 500 knights, his quill scratching over the parchment, his mind on the Turkish tents visible across the Bosphorus, utterly unaware that he was writing the first draft of the next 1,000 years. The story of Alexios I's fatal miscalculation is not just a medieval anecdote, it is a timeless parable about the limits of power, the uncontrollable nature of ideas, and the tragic comedy of a man who asked for a sword and received an apocalypse. What began as a tactical request for Western heavy cavalry to shore up the Anatolian frontier ended with the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, and the permanent estrangement of the Eastern and Western churches. Alexios's miscalculation was not that he was foolish, but that he was too brilliant for his own good. He had so perfectly manipulated the rhetoric of Christian unity that the Pope, seeing an opportunity to assert papal monarchy over all Christendom, seized the narrative and ran with it beyond any point the emperor could control. The princes he welcomed and bribed became the founders of dynasties that would rival and eventually eclipse his own. The cities he recovered, like Nicaea, were the exception, while the vast territories that fell to the Crusaders, Antioch, Edessa, Jerusalem, Tripoli, remained permanently outside the imperial orbit, forming the Latin East that drained the resources of Byzantium without adding to its strength. The long-term consequence was a weakened, isolated, and increasingly despised Byzantine Empire that, when the Fourth Crusade arrived in 1204, had no reserves of goodwill or military power to resist. The great Theodosian walls that had guarded the Queen of Cities for 8 centuries were finally breached not by the Turks but by the Crusaders Alexios had summoned, and the sack of Constantinople in April 1204, when the altars were stripped, the sacred icons trampled, a prostitute placed on the patriarch's throne, and the bronze horses of the hippodrome shipped to Venice, was the grotesque, logical culmination of the chain reaction that began with that desperate letter. The empire would eventually be restored in 1261 by Michael VIII Palaeologus, but it would be a ghost of its former self, a hollow shell waiting for the Ottoman Mem II to deliver the final blow in 1450.